Imagine this. John buys a Chinese connected car. It's impressive and quite cheap. Every day he drives along the busiest streets of a large city. Meanwhile, his car, thanks to numerous cameras, sensors, radars and an internet connection, reads a range of data, just like a smartphone on wheels. This data may end up in China, but could it also end up in the Kremlin as part of China's intelligence cooperation with Russia? This is just one scenario. In another, such a connected car could be the target of a cyber attack. Could it therefore be used for acts of sabotage? And how do we know about these risks from the Chinese themselves? In our report, Smartphones on Wheels, we described the key security and regulatory issues related to connected cars from China. In this video, we answer its most important questions. Let's start with the basics. What is a connected car? And let's already make one thing clear. A connected car is not the same as an electric car.
Inteligentny samochód, czyli 智联网链汽车, to jest
A connected car is a car connected to the internet, and we adopted this term in this report directly from the Chinese themselves. This is a breakthrough technology, not some technology of the future. These are cars that are already driving on our streets. They have numerous high-resolution cameras, sensors, and detectors. They use online maps and are connected to global satellite systems. Importantly, the means of propulsion in connected cars plays a secondary role. This connected, digitized car can be an electric car, but it can just as well be a combustion engine car or hybrid.
These intelligent and connected vehicles are equipped with a number of sensors, radars, and cameras. Officially, this is to make it easier to drive. Data are collected and transmitted. Where do Chinese cars send their data? Under the Norwegian engineers' Lion Cage research project, it was found that in a Chinese-made EV, roughly 90% of the vehicle's communications, including data ranging from voice commands to precise location information, were transmitted to China.
I Chińczycy są bardzo precyzyjni w swoich dokumentach, jak te dane należy kwalifikować.
The Chinese are very precise in their documents about how this data should be classified. They divide it into 4 categories. The most sensitive category is the data collected by connected cars, which, in the opinion of the Chinese, could lead to a potential threat to state security if it were leaked. Here, the Chinese say that connected cars are, for example, capable of collecting a very large number of data about sensitive areas because they drive past critical infrastructure, like government buildings or military zones. They also say that the more of these strips there are, the more of these cars there are on the streets, the more sensitive are the data that can be collected, because one can, for example, measure traffic intensity. That is, check that yesterday the traffic intensity around, let's say, a government building or a military zone was lower than the day before. From the point of view of intelligence analysis, this is very sensitive information. What is important is that under Chinese law, this information is classified as a state secret. The Chinese themselves say that connected cars can collect this type of information. Another category of data that Chinese cars collect is data from inside the car. According to Chinese, the data collected inside the car is really sensitive. Modern connected cars are equipped with fingerprint readers, and they can scan a great deal of data, including biometric data such as voice patterns, the shape of the ear auricle, or the iris. And this is because facial recognition technology is very common in these cars. Finally, because these cars are often paired with our other devices, such as a smartphone or smartwatch, the cars can gain information about our contacts, our telephone call history, our activity, and so on and so forth. From the point of view of privacy, these are data that can potentially violate the user's privacy.
Here's an important question. How do we know all this?
Wszystkie te informacje pozyskujemy ze źródeł otwartych.
We obtained all this information from open sources, from Chinese state documents, primarily from documents used by Chinese ministries, regulatory bodies, and standardization organizations. This is because the Chinese comprehensively regulate connected cars for the needs of their own state and their own authorities, and they issue many documents in which they talk about data security and the cybersecurity of connected vehicles. To write this report, we used 100% Chinese language materials, which are available for the most part exclusively in Chinese, because they are for the internal use of the Chinese state.
But connected cars are not only manufactured in China. So why are we only talking about Chinese cars?
Trzeba pamiętać o tym, że tak naprawdę wszystkie samochody
We
inteligentne
must remember that in fact all smart cars, that is, cars equipped with sensors, regardless of their country of origin, are potentially tools of surveillance or create vulnerabilities that allow hostile actors to take control of such a vehicle. However, at this point we need to ask the question, what country does the car come from? And first, what kind of access does this country have to the data the car contains? In the case of China, this access is granted by default from the outset. Simply put, the state requires car manufacturers to provide full access to data. This is the first distinctive Chinese characteristic. The second related issue is the assessment of the origin of a given car and whether the threats involved are political or geopolitical in nature. That is, if we are talking about the security of critical infrastructure or military units, we must ask whether the manufacturer of a given car comes from an allied or a non-allied state. And here, from this point of view, China clearly emerges as a state that is largely hostile toward the West and NATO. It is a country that cooperates very closely with the Russian Federation, also in the intelligence dimension and in arms cooperation. They have conducted a number of joint exercises, and there are many contact groups between their armed forces. All of this means that in this case, a Chinese supplier carries different strategic weight. These risks should be assessed in line with how international politics unfolds and which states may use such data with hostile intentions. Again, simply put, cars from allied states do not need to look into military units, because this is already being done by NATO soldiers who are mutually present, for example in Poland, within military bases.
Część zagrożeń, o których mówimy w raporcie.
In the report, we talk about all connected vehicles, regardless of the country of manufacture. And an example of this kind of threat is cyber attacks. All vehicles that are connected to the internet can fall victim to cyber attacks. For example, their sensors could be disrupted, or they can be remotely immobilized or accelerated, and therefore could be used for acts of sabotage. Automotive corporations all over the world are trying to develop these technologies, the technologies of digitized cars. However, the first reason why we look specifically at China in this report is that their companies are now global leaders when it comes to the development of this technology. The second reason why we are looking specifically at China is that we are observing an absolutely spectacular increase in the number of Chinese cars on European streets. In 2025, Chinese automakers sold about 810,000 vehicles in Europe, up 99% year-on-year, lifting their market share to over 6%. Some of these risks apply to all manufacturers of connected cars. However, when we are talking about cars from China, we should think primarily about three issues that distinguish Chinese companies from companies in other countries. The first issue is the intertwining of the private and the state sectors in China. Manufacturers of connected cars from China are formally private companies. However, for example, Article 7 of the Chinese National Intelligence Law tells us that citizens and organizations are obliged to cooperate with China's intelligence apparatus. We can therefore assume that in certain scenarios, the state party apparatus in China could try to exert pressure on Chinese car manufacturers in order to share the sensitive data that the cars have collected. And we have, as I mentioned, a specific article in Chinese law that enables this for the Chinese authorities. Another issue is that in the past, Chinese companies have fallen victim to strong pressure from state party apparatus. And an example of this is the case of Jack Ma, the founder of one of the three largest Chinese big tech companies, Alibaba. In 2020, he was disappeared by the Chinese authorities after he criticized Chinese regulators. Thus, the Chinese authorities, the Chinese state party apparatus, have both legal and extra-legal means to exert strong pressure on their companies. Another issue that should concern us in the context of connected cars from China is the deepening cooperation between China and Russia. China is the most important supplier of dual-use technologies to Russia. They have repeatedly conducted joint military exercises with Russia, and they have also conducted joint exercises with Belarus, including around security. And here, our interests are on opposing sides of the barricade. To manage risks effectively, we need to consider multiple scenarios. In a benign scenario, China would have little incentive to share data collected by connected vehicles with Russia. In the worst-case situation, for example, a contingency in the Taiwan Strait alongside an escalation of Russia's aggressive actions in Europe, sharing such information with Russia could align with China's interests. Finally, the Chinese clearly indicate in their state documents that for them, connected vehicles are not exclusively a civilian technology, but also have strong implications for the development of the Chinese army. And this may seem surprising, but it shouldn't be. Xi Jinping is the Chinese leader who has, for a long time now, been signaling that a civil-military fusion should be pursued. That is, divisions between civilian research and the defense industry should be eliminated in order to strengthen the Chinese army. In the context of connected cars in their own state documents, the Chinese say that connected vehicles can help them, for example, to expand and modernize their satellite navigation system called Beidou, the Big Dipper. The data collected by connected vehicles could serve to increase its precision.
But why are we focusing on Chinese vehicles? We've been hearing for years that Chinese phones, computers, televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and everything else that can be connected to the internet are spying on us.
To, co wyróżnia samochody na tle tych wszystkich technologii, to jest
What distinguishes cars from all these technologies is that only cars have such an extensive ability to collect geospatial data. While a vacuum cleaner is able to map our apartment, only a car is able to acquire so much data that is important not only from the point of view of personal security or user privacy, but also state security. Cars drive past critical infrastructure, government buildings, and military zones. Today, connected cars are no longer important only from the point of view of road safety, but also in terms of state security.
If the Chinese can spy on us with cars, can we collect data on them in the same way? Yes, we could. But China has introduced a number of legal regulations to prevent this.
Jeśli chodzi o Chiny, to taką podstawową zasadą jest to, że dane...
When it comes to China, the basic principle is that data collected by connected cars should be stored in China. That is their general rule. In the Chinese internet ecosystem, which is restricted by the Great Firewall, the flow of data is much easier to control. As for the other rules that apply in China, they mainly concern the fact that data should be anonymized if it includes, for example, the faces of passerbys or license plates of other cars. Another issue is that data should be processed inside the vehicle, and data from inside the car should not be collected without the user's consent. This is the general direction of their regulatory thinking. A particularly interesting example here is Tesla, because it shows that the Chinese believe that foreign manufacturers of connected cars pose a particular threat. And indeed, we find notes indicating this in their documents. They say that especially the development and popularization of foreign brands on Chinese streets constitutes a risk from the point of view of state security. And what do the Chinese do about this? They not only create regulations concerning cybersecurity or data security of connected cars, but they also introduce audits and a specific system of data security certification. And Tesla is the first non-Chinese brand to have obtained data security certification from the Chinese regulatory authorities. And this is an interesting case. Tesla is truly a special company. It has been producing its cars in China since 2019. Since 2021, it has even had a data center in China, because, as I mentioned, regulations oblige companies to store data collected on Chinese territory within China. And despite this, despite the factory and despite the data center, the Chinese for years restricted Tesla's access to places that, from their point of view, are sensitive for state security. For example, Teslas were not allowed to enter and park near government buildings or military zones. And finally, in places where Xi Jinping's presence was planned, Teslas also had restricted access. The security services physically limited Tesla's access to these places. We know that even in the case of some academic or research institutions, Teslas had to park several blocks away. Such restrictions were applied to Tesla until the Chinese tested their data security.
Here it's worth looking at what Western countries are doing. What have they done to limit the data collection capabilities of Chinese smartphones on wheels?
Prym w tym zakresie wiodą Stany Zjednoczone. Jeszcze za administracji prezydenta Bidena wprowadzono 100%.
The United States is leading the way in this field. Already under President Biden's administration, 100% tariffs were introduced on connected vehicles from China, and later, invoking the National Security Clause, vehicles with software from China and Russia were banned, starting with the 2027 model year. Thus, Americans do not allow connected vehicles from China to drive on their streets. After the Americans did this, the international debate on these vehicles having an extensive ability to collect sensitive data heated up significantly. Subsequent countries, citing security aspects, decided to restrict the entry of Chinese cars into certain zones. One such country is, for example, Israel, which withdrew Chinese cars used by its officers and banned Chinese cars from entering certain military zones on their territory. That is what media reports tell us. The United Kingdom is another such country. It restricts the movement of electric cars, without indicating their origin, around certain military zones. The United Kingdom also prohibits discussing topics sensitive from the point of view of security in the cars used by employees of its Ministry of Defense. Yet another country is the Czech Republic. The National Cyber and Information Security Agency indicated that connected vehicles from China are high-risk products or vehicles when it comes to cybersecurity issues. And recently, Poland's Defense Ministry press service has confirmed that preparations were underway to limit the entry of Chinese-manufactured vehicles to protected military areas.
Now that we know what we are up against, how can we protect ourselves from these risks?
Jeśli chodzi o przepisy unijne, to trwa obecnie ocena ryzyka prowadzona.
When it comes to EU regulations, a risk assessment is currently underway under the NIS2 directive. The risk assessment concerns connected vehicles, and based on this assessment, the EU will decide whether it wants to issue specific regulations or recommendations for member states regarding connected vehicles. The EU has certain regulations regarding data collection. The prime example is, of course, the GDPR. And the GDPR also applies to connected vehicles to the extent that their sensors collect personal data. Another example is the EU Data Act, which treats cars as connected devices and says you can't send their data abroad or hand it to foreign authorities. We also have a number of regulations concerning vehicle homologation. However, the fact that this is a breakthrough technology is problematic. It's developing very quickly and cannot be regulated once and for all. This is the Chinese approach. They no longer create large laws on cybersecurity or data security. They already have these regulations. Instead, they try to regulate intelligent vehicles at the administrative level and at the level of technical standardization. That is, by issuing instructions for car manufacturers precisely in order to regularly conduct audits and check the level of data security or cybersecurity of cars. And I think this approach should be an inspiration for EU regulators. That is, to realize that this technology is groundbreaking and cannot be regulated once and for all, but that regulatory frameworks must be adapted and changed.
The economy is another issue. Are the measures against Chinese cars an attempt to save the automotive industry in Europe?
Ja sądzę, że nie da się uratować europejskiej motoryzacji.
I believe that it's not possible to save the European automotive industry by focusing exclusively on slowing down Chinese expansion. More needs to happen here. However, in the case of cars today, we must take the aspect of cybersecurity very seriously. And we must do this, among other things, because that's precisely what the Chinese are doing. China introduced data security tests on their territory in 2024, which apply to both domestic and foreign manufacturers.
Przy okazji dyskusji o samochodach z Chin
In the course of discussing cars from China, a question arises that is being asked in many European capitals, namely whether regulations, particularly digital regulations, can in some way help European manufacturers regain their initiative and competitiveness, and somehow reclaim the automotive market in which the Chinese are performing increasingly well. It seems to me that regulation is certainly not a panacea. For Europe, if manufacturers, final integrators and subcontractors are all to regain competitiveness, there is a whole range of things that need to be done related to labour costs, energy costs, but also work on innovation. In my view, however, digital regulations are important not only from a security standpoint, but also precisely from the perspective of developing modern digital industries in Poland and across Europe. It seems to me that these are two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, regulations that are truly necessary in this dimension make it possible to protect certain fundamental security interests. On the other hand, if, for example, access to critical infrastructure or to European roads is made conditional on the use of a trusted European supplier, we simultaneously create space for European companies to develop in an area that is probably the Achilles heel of the European automotive industry today, namely the digital domain. Simply put, regulations that limit access for untrusted states mean that trusted, modern solutions can begin to emerge here in Europe, solutions that could appear in connected vehicles. And all of this together, I think, could increase the competitiveness of the European automotive industry, including in Poland. So are all Chinese vehicles dangerous?
Jeśli chodzi o odpowiedź na wyzwania, które tworzą inteligentne samochody, sensory na kółkach,
When it comes to responding to the challenges posed by connected cars, smartphones on wheels, one must first and foremost realize that this is not a hypothetical challenge looming somewhere on the horizon. It is a risk that is already materializing on our roads today. Therefore, European states, including Poland, should act quickly and focus above all on critical areas, critical infrastructure, military units, and all areas that are important from the point of view of state security, just as the Chinese themselves have done by regulating their own roads and access for connected vehicles. As for a broader response, a number of challenges arise here because cars and mobility are something that very strongly connects the European Union. If the entire EU, if each member state individually begins to regulate or restrict access, this could lead to very deep divisions in the European market. We would not want our car to have to be certified separately for each market in order to drive on holiday to the other end of Europe. Hence the importance of EU-wide regulations, and once again, in this critical area, more regulation is truly needed. We can see how the Chinese are doing this. They regulate this area very intensively. As part of various actions aimed at increasing the digital security of the Union, there are a number of initiatives related to cybersecurity being undertaken at the EU level, and it would be worthwhile for connected vehicles, cars equipped with sensors and connected to the internet, to be treated as potential threats on a par with other elements we traditionally associate with such risks, like telecommunications, mobile phones, or, more broadly, the Internet of Things. Because within this broad group of electronics and computers that accompany us, the car plays the role of the most important electronic component, one that we move around in. This means that a pan-European response seems optimal from this perspective, although I think that some actions, such as restricting access to the most critical areas, should be taken as quickly as possible, including at the level of individual member states. When it comes to choices at the consumer level, this challenge is in fact common to all internet-connected devices that originate from untrusted states, states that are in some way unfriendly from a security perspective, in this case China. One could say that when I buy a smartphone or a smart vacuum cleaner that collects my personal data, I alone assume that risk. However, the car has a special role here because it is no longer only about our own data or our own privacy. Unlike small electronics, a car moves through cities, scans the faces of passers-by, scans our surroundings, and is capable of extracting far more information than any other internet-connected device. Therefore, from my point of view, for all individuals who are in any way connected with the state with critical infrastructure, as well as businesses that possess sensitive information, as with any equipment originating from China, we need to ask ourselves whether we really want to have electronics from a state that assumes from the outset that all data collected by technology companies must be transferred to the security services and the state apparatus. But beyond this individual dimension, in the case of cars, we also have a broader question about the role they play in our cities, in areas sensitive from the point of view of the state. So in this particular case, it is not merely a consumer choice. It is a choice that affects the wider environment and the security of the state. The full report on Chinese cars is available to read at osw.waw.pl, and you can find links to films from our archive on screen now.